Hi, everyone. Today, I'd like to welcome a special guest, Dr. Lorcan Daly, an exercise physiologist from Ireland. Dr. Daly, please give us a little bit of background about yourself.
Thanks a million, Lucas. Yeah, so I'm an exercise physiologist. I'm an assistant lecturer in sport and exercise science, working out of Technological University of the Shannon. So that's a university right in the centre of Ireland. And I've started doing lots of research recently in terms of masters, athletes' performance, aging, physiology, that sort of area.
Right, and that's where you might have seen Lorcan's name pop up. He is the grandson of Richard Morgan, and Lorcan published a couple papers in the last few years about one about his grandfather, who's a Masters world champion and Masters rower, and also about three other Masters level athletes. So we're hoping to talk about those papers and topics today. So I was hoping we could start with your grandfather. Can you just tell us a little bit about his background for those that may not know?
Yeah, so it was quite unique. He was basically essentially entirely inactive for his whole life. He did a little bit of sports when he was in secondary school, hurling, which is an Irish stick and ball game, but not very much at all. Then no sport or no exercise throughout his whole life into retirement, and essentially he took up rowing at the age of 73, and then got heavily into it, and then started competing and then got up to a very high level. He won 4 world championships at different ages. So he would annually travel to Boston, where they'd usually have the world championships. I went to Boston twice and once to Washington for other world championships. So very cool to see him progress and do so well. And it was cool to see him go with him for his competitions. But yeah, he got to a fantastic level of fitness. Really enjoyed the process, and we all saw the benefits in terms of his energy and his mood at such an old age, which was fantastic.
Right. So before we get into the more details about his regimen, can we talk about his background? So you said he didn't do much exercise. He played a little bit of sports when he was younger, but was he always relatively fit in terms of body composition?
Yeah, so he actually used to heavily smoke as well. It was another thing I forgot to mention there. But no, he was never like overweight or anything. But I wouldn't say he'd be just kind of a normal. He'd be still slim person, but just not totally inactive. Did nothing in terms of exercise. So it was a kind of a big change, and I suppose a unique experiment of nature. In that often master athletes, some of them certainly will start later in life, but very few would be that late and get up
Hmm.
to such a high level. So definitely we got some interesting insight from that.
Yes, definitely. And was his career? What did he do for his career? Was it a sedentary career, or did he was he active?
So he actually started life as a baker when he was quite young and did that for a number of years. And then he sort of transferred into what you might call now as a chemical engineer, although they didn't really have job titles. So he was involved in different factories producing batteries a lot. He even went to Japan for a period with a company. So his role was to oversee a number of things, much like probably what an engineer would do today. So yeah, his job not entirely sedentary. He'd be just probably walking around a little bit, but nothing, not like he was doing hard labor certainly or anything else.
Okay, that's definitely interesting. And then in terms of your family background, genetics, other relatives in your family, are they long lived? Are they healthy?
I would say they would live definitely long. I mean, his own sister, he's an older sister, and she's still alive now. So I think she's like 96, possibly 97 now, and she still drives the car daily.
Mm.
She's quite interesting. She had a very interesting career as well. She went to college in her 50s, and then became a barrister in her late 50s, and then retired at something like 93. So yeah, quite in terms of that side of the family, definitely I'd say there is maybe something in the genes in terms of longevity.
Hmm. Okay. Okay, now that we have some background, that's great. Let's talk about more about your grandfather's regimen. So when he started exercising at 70, 73, I think,
Yeah.
he got into rowing. Can you just tell the audience what he did for his rowing, I guess, exercises?
Yeah, he basically built up I suppose, a bit of a workload, a bit of a tolerance. It all kind of started, he used to drop my cousin to Rowan. My cousin used to compete, and he basically hopped on a machine and was, basically playing around with it. And one of the coaches commented, "You have an excellent sort of a technique. You should give it a go." And then he started to try it out a bit. So I think he started maybe twice, 3 times a week then. And then when they also had a Concept 2 in their garage, which my cousin used to use, he started to use that a lot. And eventually then he just slowly started building up his training volume. I'd say he used to 2Ks most day or different volumes. And then he just was away with it, then decided to compete at the Masters, at the Irish Masters Championships after a few years. I won that, but indeed he was the only one in his age category, as he commented. But then I suppose got more encouraged, went to World Championships, and then year on year I think was progressing a good bit in terms of that. And then eventually he was, near in stages where he could win it, and then he won. He did indeed win the few, but many years he'd be bronze, silver, and then the 4 golds at different stages.
And the age categories are what? Are they 75 plus, or how do they work, the age categories?
Yeah, so I think it's every 5 years, so 70, 75, 75, 80.
Okay. So there's enough competitors at those advanced ages that make it worthwhile, I guess.
Yeah, there's definitely a few at the very high up, probably 90, 95. You might only be talking 3, 4 competitors, but definitely there'd be a few. And he'd be definitely conscious, I think, a lot of these older masters that, once you're at the end of an age bracket, it's a good bit harder. But then once you're the young side of a new bracket, you'll really go for it. So you'll try, and that'll probably give you that extra bit of encouragement. Once you hit 75, for instance, you're in the new category, you're the younger guy, and it would motivate them a lot. So yeah, that's an interesting point as well. He would, but definitely he had a little bit of periodization in terms of his training. He'd do some periods where you do big volumes. He might do 2 a day sessions, and he might just have a target of covering 10, 20 kilometers in the morning, do it again in the evening. Other times he'd be doing more intensity, but not like a very strictly periodized program or anything like that. Most of it was he'd just go out and do 2Ks as fast as he could, take a break and do something else. So a little bit haphazard, but
it wasn't very structured then. Okay.
Not so much structured, but definitely like he would be out every day and he'd have a target that he'd say, okay, I'm going to try and cover 10K, or I'm going to do the 2K in this time, but not a strict plan in terms of that. But he would definitely be consistently going out.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I guess the way it broke down from what I was reading in the paper, it was a pyramid of intensity, right? So his protocol mostly at the base was lower intensity zone 2, and then a few times a week, or maybe 1 or 2 times a week, he would do the higher intensity zone 4, 5.
Definitely. So it was definitely a mix, but in the general, when you look at the bigger picture, it would follow a pyramidal template, as you said, where most of the distances covered certainly are lower intensity, some intermediate, and then some periods where he's going all out, or he might be doing shorter bursts or intervals. When you look at the wider picture, definitely.
So how did he manage his intensity protocol to avoid injury?
Yeah, so he never got injured, first of all, I suppose, with the Rowan. So I would say you do have a little bit more flexibility with the like a rowing or even indoor cycling or something in terms of injury. There's no real mechanical damage much in terms of running. You might get tight hamstrings or whatever. Certainly a lot of rowers will get back pain, but he had never any issue with that. But it's very safe and controlled. And just, I suppose, the way his volume and intensity was spread out, he was fairly okay, and it worked out for him. Like, he wasn't doing crazy intensities all the time for shorter periods or anything like that, too condensed. So the way he modeled it worked out fine for him. And he had a nice spread in terms of the pyramidal spread, as we said there, which probably covered him.
Mm-hmm. And then just going back to how many championships did he end up winning?
I think four world championships, a good number of Irish championships. I'm not too sure, and I think I have the numbers somewhere, but a good few more bronzes and silvers at the world championships. But definitely the 4 wins.
So a
It
lot of
could be
go ahead.
could be around eight World Championship medals. I have a feeling around that number.
So he medaled quite a bit.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. Okay, and then in terms of his exercise regimen, he also did some strength training, I understand, right?
Yes, so he had weights, dumbbells in his shed there, and he did that on average twice a week, sometimes three times a week. So he would do the like of rows, lunges, curls, even some RDLs with that. So he'd those adjustable weights, so he could move them up or down. He had a good number of weights there as well. So yeah, that's in terms of a regimen for aging. It worked out perfect in that if you have some combination of aerobic exercise, some combination of resistance, you're going to do well, and that just happens to be exactly what you should be doing for rowing. So it worked quite well for him.
Yeah, fantastic. So then that obviously translated into his pretty remarkable physiological characteristics, right? I mean, he was very lean. He had a high muscle mass from what I was reading. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, quite lean, low body fat, a high total muscle mass, and definitely the resistance exercise contributed to that. And yeah, his aerobic qualities were exceptionally high too. Probably the most exceptional result was his oxygen uptake kinetics, which was similar to what you'd see for a 25, 30-year-old. Healthy but inactive, but still like when, he's 70 years beyond that, which is quite remarkable.
Hmm. And his
So
VO2 max was really high too, right?
his VO2 max, yeah, what was that? Maybe 22 mils. Quite high, definitely, but I think the thing that was the most exceptional was his VO2 on kinetics at the start of exercise. So what might be going on with the discrepancy there is that we'll say his peripheral oxygen extraction and use in terms of the level of the muscle, we think that's probably exceptionally developed. And we think it's given us clues in terms of what might happen with aging, where some systems might deteriorate more or less than others. And this would add to a lot of evidence that in terms of the peripheral system, the muscle's ability to take in and use oxygen, we think that can remain exceptionally highly functioning throughout aging. Whereas other systems, you will see, of course, a decline, but in terms of the peripheral, much less so, it seems.
Okay, so you've seen that translate to other Masters level champions as well?
Yes,
Okay.
there's now a building body of work, and even with the other three masters I looked at, we saw that so even just thinking of Richard there, for instance, his VO2 max was lower than a 30-year-old, but his, we'll say, peripheral extraction is the same as a 30-year-old. So that's given us more clues. But yeah, there is lots of research. If you took like a biopsy of a highly trained endurance master athlete, if they were, I don't know, 6 years old, if you just looked at that, you wouldn't be able to maybe tell that they were a certain age. They'd have a high mitochondrial content, function, citrate synthase would be high. So yeah, definitely it seems that the muscle is highly plastic, and that will respond really well to endurance training. And of course, you might lose some hemoglobin mass, you might lose a bit of your heart rate over time, but it seems that the muscle can stay really quite highly functioning. And even another example in the other three masters athletes, their VO2 on kinetics was also exceptionally high relatively. Whereas, so for instance, Ken, the 52-year-old, his was the same as a young Olympic champion. So no difference in terms of that measure. And the other two athletes, the 60 and 70-year plus world champion, they were still far better than a normal, healthy 25-year-old. But again, just a small bit lower than an Olympic champion. So yeah, it's interesting when you view all the results together. It does seem like the muscle in particular, your mitochondria will respond really well and stay to a very high level if you stay training.
And for the lay people, can you talk about how you make these measurements?
Yes, so it's all based on the metabolic art. So for instance, your VO2 max, you might do a step or some kind of incremental protocol where you keep increasing the wattage or the speed you're running at or whatever until eventually you'll reach your VO2 max and you can't progress further. So the VO2 on kinetics is essentially you're at rest and you're consuming a certain amount of oxygen. And then what you do is you start exercise, and how quickly you can increase your oxygen consumption is a very good indicator of your peripheral muscles' ability to take in and use oxygen. So the faster that you can increase that rate, usually the better the function. And practically, it's going to be very useful for you at the start of exercise. If you have a very slow increase in your VO2 consumption, you'll be by nature burning a load of your anaerobic finite fuel stores. But if you can get the VO2 up very quickly, that's now sustainable. So it's both a marker of your function and it's also useful in terms of exercise performance.
Okay. And are there surrogates for these measurements that can be done outside the lab?
That's a good question. Now, definitely for the VO2 max, you could, for instance, we'll say you could do the same protocol on the bike just without measurement. But if you know, okay, if I go up 25 watts every minute, let's say I get to 300 watts, then you can just look at a study. Well, someone who got to 300 watts got, I don't know, a VO2 max of 50 mils per kilo. So then you could do the maths. There would be a fairly close relationship that you could probably be in around 50. Now, it would be much harder to estimate your VO2 on kinetics. I think you would definitely need some kind of measurement for that. But definitely you can estimate your VO2 max fairly reliably, I would say.
Okay. So what are the gold standards in terms of being able, could you link some of those papers or send them to me and I can link them to this video after in terms of where people can gauge where they're at?
Definitely, yeah. I can send some examples or some resources for sure.
That'd be fantastic. And then any other measurements that stood out for your grandfather?
Again, as you said, he had a high muscle mass. He'd a high power on the ergometer. So we did an additional test, whereas we basically see how much power he can produce even for 1 second, just to give us an idea of his ceiling for power. And that was quite high, so that would tell us probably the resistance training is working. But yeah, definitely the key takeaway is that you do need the resistance training and the aerobic training, because we see different examples of studies in masters where, for instance, master powerlifters who only do the resistance, they don't have the aerobic fitness, but they do have the muscle mass. Vice versa then, maybe if you look at master swimmers who perhaps didn't do resistance exercise and they have the aerobic qualities, but they're losing a lot of their fast twitch fibers, they're losing a lot of power. So it's basically you need to use it or lose it with those two systems. So that's probably the key message, and Richard's study is a prime example of that.
Right. And then also you can train those two systems even when you start at a later age, right?
Definitely, yeah. And they will improve. I mean, there's some even studies there. Well, one of the most fantastic studies I've seen is in a 101-year-old cyclist who improved his VO2 max from the age of 101 to 103. So that was quite a remarkable study. And then he lived on to 110. But there is many studies. I know there's Luc van Loon in Maastricht University has a few, and I think they had participants 90, 95 plus, and they managed to increase their strength, type 2 fiber count. So the body will respond, and it's remarkable to see even at these really high ages that it can still adapt and respond, which is very encouraging for everyone.
That's very encouraging for all of us, yes. And then in these studies, do they see a higher incidence of injury in some of these athletes?
I'd say, just from what I've read, it seems like many of the master athletes in these types of case studies or longer term analysis manage to stay injury free, and that's probably a key thing. So whether by accident or design, they have their training load set up in such a way that it's sustainable. So thinking of my colleague Bas van Horen had done 2 studies in marathon and mid-distance runners at various ages in around 70, but they did a lot of low intensity work and they didn't really push the intervals too far with the running. Many other ones in terms of cycling, rowing, again, sustainable stuff, and they managed to stay injury free. Now, you would imagine at an older age, injured, you probably would be inclined to lose a lot of fitness, lose a lot of muscle mass depending on the injury if you're unable to train, which could be more detrimental at an older age to become injured, and it'd be harder to get back. So definitely staying injury free is the key thing, and just managing the load. making sustainable progress is probably key to that.
Okay. And then is there a particular exercise that you would recommend for somebody that's, maybe had a average lifestyle or maybe more sedentary and they want to get into become more fitter and extend their health span and lifespan? Is there a particular exercise, whether rowing, cycling, what would you recommend?
Yeah, I'm could be biased, but I definitely think that the rowing and the resistance exercise is, if I could give someone a thing to choose who's trying to optimize whatever they want, I think those two together will be best. Now, a bit of a cliche, but the best protocol for anyone like that is going to be the one that they enjoy and want to do, or maybe if they
Exactly.
could do it with friends. But I think physiologically, if you're looking to really just maximize and you would do anything, probably the rowing and the resistance exercise for me. So if you think of the rowing, it's again fairly safe. Like, I mean, I've done periods there where like 2 weeks of, I just tried out really heavy intervals every day for 2 weeks, see what happens, and you're fine. If you did that running, it would be very unsustainable. So you can't really go wrong.
How was his diet? I guess when he was younger and then also when he started to compete in rowing.
Yeah, his diet, I suppose, I'm not too sure of his younger years, to be honest, but I think generally fine. He maintained a stable weight throughout his adult life. Probably wouldn't describe it as unhealthy, or I'd say fairly normal, because yeah, he was never at any stage overweight or anything like that. But there's genetic components. All my relations that side generally aren't overweight. But yeah, I would say quite normal. He wouldn't overeat or anything like that. During his training period, he basically maintained a steady weight also. So he was conscious that he was a lightweight rower. Now, honestly, he was actually quite comfortably under the weight requirement. So it's a 75 kilo cutoff. So during competitions, he would just nearly go on the scales in his shoes and jumper, and he'd be still under.
Mm,
So he wasn't too worried. And of course, in rowing, if you have a bit more mass, that would actually benefit you.
mm,
But yeah, his diet, what we found was that it was quite high in protein, which would be useful, of course, for maintaining his mass, responding well to the resistance exercise. So he was conscious of that. And he also, for instance, he ate beetroot, having heard that there might be some benefit for that in terms of your aerobic performance. And he did, to some degree, periodize his carbohydrate intake. So sounds very fancy, but he kind of did it by accident. He basically, when he was doing loads of training, he essentially got his wife, Rita, my granny, to basically bake more scones. He loved these scones and he used to have many scones every day. So when he'd be doing the multiple sessions a day, longer volumes, his appetite would go up and he would essentially eat more scones, so more carbohydrates. And then maybe if he had a period of lower volume, he would just essentially eat a bit less carbohydrates. But yeah, diet rich in lots of salad. He'd have a salad. He had a very consistent diet, very similar lunches, dinners, and breakfast throughout the decades, really. But the consistent theme was that there was high protein and then adequate carbohydrate to support his training, and essentially not losing or increasing his weight. So at weight maintenance throughout the 20 plus years.
okay. So it was an omnivore diet. He
Yeah.
had, a balance of his macronutrients. I understood that he ate essentially around 2 pounds of, wait, sorry, it was 1 pound of protein per body weight, right? When you convert it to, is that right?
To pounds, I think. Yeah.
Or you can say in the kilograms, that's fine.
Yeah, just trying to convert in around that. I think in around 1.3 gram per kg, just off the top of my head, something like that, but well within the recommendations.
Sorry, yeah,
For
one gram per pound, I meant to say, yeah. Okay.
in around that, definitely, yeah,
Or
that
around
works.
2 grams per kilogram, right?
Yeah, it could be like that. No, I don't
Yeah.
have it
No,
open
that's
here.
okay. We don't have to get too specific. And then you said he would he would maintain his carbohydrates and he would consume more when he was exercising more. And then his main sources of
Yes.
carbohydrates would be, he said, scones, but what other source of carbohydrates would he intake?
Yeah, the scones were kind of the top up. They were like wholemeal scones, but he would eat different breads. He'd have Weetabix. He'd also regularly have potatoes and or rice for his dinner. So lots of good sources of carbohydrates. Generally low enough in fat. And yeah, sorry, I just took a glance there at it, but yeah, in around the 2 kilos per fat-free mass, so probably around 1.9 per kg. So in around that gram per pound, as you said, for the protein.
And then the sources of the protein were what typically?
Yeah, he would have, for instance, with his lunch, he'd regularly have ham. He'd have Weetabix and milk for the breakfast. He would also have a protein shake after training as well. For his dinner, he would have a meat source, so it could be chicken curry, it could be pork chops, it could be beef, something like that. But yeah, so lots of different sources of protein, and a lot of animal sources as well with it.
Okay. And he consumed vegetables. You said he had salads, so he also consumed vegetables, right?
Yeah, lots of veg. And every lunch he would have a good amount of salad, so probably high in fiber too. But yeah, every meal would have some kind of veg with it as part of the curry, or it would be broccoli or carrots, that type of thing with his meals, definitely.
And then in terms of calorie consumption, do you have any idea was he in a deficit or was he maintaining caloric intake compared to his expenditure?
Yeah, he was definitely maintaining because his weight was extremely consistent all year round, no real change. His diet was quite consistent. I have it there in the study. I'm not sure of the calories, but exactly that. There was no real movement year on year, essentially the same. And so it just supported what he was doing. So as we said there, some periods he'd be training more, doing the longer sessions twice per day, and he would just eat more accordingly. So it all worked out to be maintenance regularly.
Okay. And then in terms of, can you give us an idea of how many calories he would burn on a typical rowing session? I know some of them are more intense and less intense, but can you give us an idea?
So probably around 500 to 800 per session, probably possibly more on those longer sessions. So really probably the duration is the key thing there for that. If it's the longer sessions, if it's the twice a day, you could be adding up to 1,000, possibly more calories. And then the more interval ones, probably that bit shorter, just because the duration will be a bit shorter, but in around that. So good amounts at some points.
So I imagine he was ravenous on those days or shortly after those days.
Yeah. So we all comment on Rita's patience for continually feeding him and making all the scones every day. So
Fantastic. Okay, so just to summarize this part about your grandfather, starting late, it's never too late, right? It's important to train both your aerobic and anaerobic systems. And then anything else you want to add to that before I want to talk a little bit about what the average person can do in terms of measurements that you've learned from the study? What can they measure? What's worth measuring? We talked a little bit about this, VO2 max and so on, but what's worth measuring and how can they do that? So kind of circling back to what we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, so even I would say even more important than the like of measuring your VO2 max, I think just your basic exercise performance, which VO2 max is only a subcomponent of that. But you know what Richard was doing there, measuring his 2K performance. That's a culmination. Yes, your VO2 max is key for that, but it's also your power, your anaerobic qualities, your ability to sustain a high percentage of your VO2 max. So it's, the outcome ultimately is your exercise performance. So for whoever's considering a measurement like that, I would just stick to your overall performance, whether it's a 5K run, whatever you're doing. It doesn't have to be a standardized test. Ideally, it would be something like a 5K or a 2K, so you could know, well, here's normative values for the population. But definitely, I think we can get too bogged down in terms of, physiological measurements. But really, just your overall performance. It's ultimately that's integrative physiology is your performance, a time trial, something like that for the aerobic. In terms of the strength, if you're definitely further along, you could do something like a sit to stand test and get a population normative measurement for that. But really, I think the exercises yourself that you're doing can act as the measurement. If you're getting stronger over time for whatever exercise you're doing, whether it's a squat or whether it's some kind of row or bench press in terms of resistive exercise, that's perfect. And that's nearly all you need. Once you know what you're able to do, and if you know you're adding to it, it's simple, but I would say that's nearly better than a periodic physiological assessment.
Fantastic. Okay, let's extend these findings that you've had from your grandfather to your most recent study, which was published this year in January, where you looked at 3 additional master's level rowers. Can you give us a little background about these individuals in terms of their age and anything you know about their background?
Yeah, so 3 other rowers. They're 3 Irish guys, and they knew of Richard. Some of them were friends with Richard from similar competitions. So it's a nice profile across the lifespan because they were the 50 plus, 60 plus, and 70 plus world champions. So it's very interesting to see that spread. They're all quite serious. For instance, Ken, the 50-year-old, and Dennis, the 60-year-old, basically rowed their whole life. Paul, the 70-year-old, rowed for the majority of his life. I think he had maybe a 15-year hiatus, but then came back. Quite active. I suppose different to Richard in that regard. But we learnt a good amount from them. They were quite different as well in terms of their physiology and their training. And we could see it in terms of differences in their profiles. But much like what I was saying there, the integrative nature of exercise, they might have had different profiles, but they all added up to be world champion. So it tells us that there's many ways to become a world champion, or many ways to get to a high level. From vastly different training approaches and physiology, you can still get there, which was very interesting.
So can you just talk a little bit about their profiles? You mentioned it a little bit before, but the profile of these 3 individuals, what stood out for each of them?
Yeah, so for Ken, he was extremely powerful. So he's the 50-year-old. He's extremely muscular, extremely powerful, really high peak power output. I mean, just this year, since that study, he won another World Championships in the 500 meters for the World Indoor Championships. And in terms of the overall World Championships, from anyone of any age, he was the 5th best, including all the younger athletes. So that's quite remarkable when he's 52 now. So he was extremely, extremely good at the short distances. And then at the other end, we had Paul, the 70-year-old. He was quite strong in the 500 meters as well, the short distance. And then the 60-year-old Dennis, he was a bit more endurance-based. He preferred longer distances. He had really good 5K times, but he hadn't that peak power. And in fact, he didn't like resistance exercise. He didn't do any strength training, and he did all more longer distance stuff. So his power profile was a good bit flatter than the other 2 guys, whereas the other 2 guys had a high peak power for a short duration. He hadn't that, but he had a really good stay-in power. So whether you went from a 2K to a 5K, for instance, his average power would go down a small bit, whereas the other guys might have more of a drop because they're more power-based. So quite opposite, those 2 profiles, but then still remarkable then that they're all at the 2K then, which is obviously their event, which you need both. They all were World Championship winners then for that.
Interesting. So can you talk a little bit about their training paradigms? How did they look? Did they stick mostly to their strengths, or did they train all modalities, or both modalities, I should say?
Yeah, so the 2 guys either end, Ken, the 52-year-old, and Paul, the 72 now, they did a more classic type training, lots of low intensity, long duration, and then maybe 2 to 3 heavy interval sessions a week. And they both regularly resistance trained, maybe 2 to 3 times a week, hitting all muscle groups in around that. And then Dennis, the 62-year-old, as I mentioned there, did no resistance exercise, but he did a lot of hard intervals. I remember the first time I saw his program, like, it just looked like that was going to be painful. He might do 20 rounds of a minute, essentially all out with a minute rest, and just long sessions, many repetitions of intervals. Or he might do something like 6 2Ks, near enough his best 2K pace. And, to actually run that workout, I don't know how you could stomach it, but he did really hard intervals and all endurance focused. Lots of long, slow distance as well. But then, the no strength training. So it's interesting then to see, you could see it in their profiles. Dennis being much flatter in terms of power output over time. And even in terms of how they approach the race. So the two guys either end, Ken and Paul, would come out quite quick out of the blocks, slow down a bit, and then have a big burst at the finish. Whereas Dennis would have a perfectly flat pace across the whole race. So that's interesting as well. That would nearly fit in with their physiology in terms of what they can handle.
So do you think Dennis's ceiling could be even higher if he found a way to incorporate strength training into his training?
Yeah, definitely. And I think I said it to him, and probably the other lad said it to him. And then I had a line in the study about that. And then since that, he said, "All right, I'll start strength training." So now he is strength training. So we'll see what's going to happen. But he is starting to do it now. Yeah, definitely.
Right. And then do these? You said they were training. They were rowing most of their lives. Were they athletic in any other ways, or were they just, that was a primary exercise that they just did rowing most of their lives?
Yeah, I know Paul did basketball mostly, actually, for most of his life. I think he was playing basketball up to the age of 60 at quite a high enough level for a lot of his life. I'm not certain with Dennis. I think he mostly did rowing, unless I could be mistaken. And then Ken did a good bit of resistance exercise, not necessarily powerlifting, but had a good focus on that. But I'm not certain about the rest, whether they played maybe like a Gaelic games or other sports as well when they were younger. I'm not too sure. Okay. But yeah, definitely it was Paul was the main one who did a good long period with the basketball, and he would have liked to continue that. Only the risk of injury he felt was high, so then moved over to rowing.
Okay. And what about their diets? Can you talk about their diets?
Yeah, so a little bit similar to Richard in that they generally maintain their body weights across the year. Ken, the 52-year-old, he sat a little bit higher above it, so he would cut down a bit. And so, but to be fair, that's probably much like what you would see for an Olympian at the lightweight level. They would float a bit above it and then try and get very lean so that they're maximizing the amount of muscle mass that they have while they're very lean during the race. And he was like that. He would, maybe he could come down 3 or 4 kilos, whereas the other guys would come down, maybe they might float a kilo or two above it and then just a slight cut just to get down. But that would be no fuss at all. I mean, even as Paul said, he would just essentially not eat a dessert for a week and then he'd be there. So very minimal. But yeah, in general, I think fairly consistent in terms of protein. They would eat a lot of calories as well. They were doing a lot of training load to match that. I think Ken was in around nearly 4,000 calories, so fairly high. I think they were all quite high, but yeah, they were ticking the box in terms of protein, high carbohydrate. That was the definite theme across them all.
Okay. So anything else that you took away from the study of these 3 additional master's level rowers that you could add to the findings from your grandfather for individuals that are looking to improve their health and extend their health and lifespans?
Yeah, I think a lot of the same things, but we really fleshed it out that you can see it across that. I think the new thing from those guys were that you could be quite different in terms of your profile and still be the best in the world for your age group. But definitely there was the same theme of they had, exceptionally high VO2 max, but in terms of their peripheral muscle function was, for Ken, essentially it's the same as a Olympic champion, and the other guys not too far off it. What else? Their efficiency was actually very, very similar to an Olympic champion, almost no difference even across the 3 of them. So highly efficient in terms of the amount of power they can produce relative to their energy intake or relative to the energy they're burning. But I think, takeaways for anyone, it's that same message that probably you do need to do the resistive and the endurance exercise to get all the adaptations you're looking for and all the ones that will contribute to aging. I think the key thing definitely that was hit home with these three athletes, they were highly different in terms of their training approach, but the one thing that was similar was that they had a linear type progression, so that they knew, okay, I'm doing intervals at 150 per 500. Next week, I'm going to do 151 per 500, or sorry, 149. They're going to chop down the times. There's always a progression mechanism. They're either adding volume, but in nearly always across them all, they knew the times that it would take to win a world championship, and they would increase their intervals up to that power output. And that's exactly probably what you should be if you're able to do it. So yeah, but they were exceptionally driven. If you ask them why might you do all this training, and they just want to win. That's probably the main thing they want to do. So they're quite competitive. Even they were in some way hesitant to tell me their training programs in case all their competitors might do it. So they were a little bit shy with that, but definitely as well, it's easy to read it, but it's harder to implement it. But I think that was a key thing, and you could apply that to resistance or endurance exercise. If you're progressing it one way, then you're going to tick all the boxes. And we see that you can have a wildly different approach, but once it's progressive, you'll push the limit and you'll get to a high function.
Okay. So one of the last questions I want to ask you is, I think, in general, the evidence is very strong that the earlier you start, whether it's aerobic or anaerobic exercise, the better, right? So you yourself, you're a young individual. How are you incorporating these findings into your training regimen, and how should an average person, I guess, incorporate it? Somebody that's in the younger 30, 40s.
Yeah, I'm basically essentially copying them. I'm doing a very similar. I've seen all their programs. I've just kind of ran it myself almost. So, and I even compete with them now at indoor championships. I'm definitely not as good, but I'm using definitely the knowledge I've got from them. So yeah, that's what I do now, is indoor rowing and resistance exercise, trying to tick all the boxes. And I think anyone can take that message. If you can fit the two of them in, look at your weekly schedule, what can be done, what will you enjoy, maybe sit down of an evening and decide that. The details don't hugely matter. Once you're adding to it a bit, you will get there. Something that you can keep doing that's not going to cause you an injury, etc., something you enjoy, and then that's all you need to do, really. It's probably is simpler than we make out, but probably that one rule is that you need the two strands of exercise to tick all the boxes.
Yeah, and it's a lot better than doing nothing, right? So if you're doing something, you don't have to get down into the nitty gritty about how many times a week, how often, how long the duration, as long as you're doing it and you're trying to improve.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there's many studies you'll see exactly like what you're saying. If you just do literally a tiny bit of exercise, I mean, there's some there, I might be wrong on the numbers, but if you go from like 4,000 to 8,000 steps a day, you've essentially halved your mortality risk from a huge number of things. So literally, the smallest dose of exercise will be the best benefit if you're doing nothing. Absolutely.
Fantastic. Well, I'd like to thank you for your time today. And if people are interested in looking at your research and following you, where can they find you?
So I post all my research on ResearchGate. You should be able to just look up Lorcan Daly. But if you do want to email me, absolutely. My email is lorcan.daly@tus.ie. And I'd be happy to send on anything or answer any questions.
Fantastic. Well, again, appreciate your time today. Looking forward to seeing more of your research and potentially touching base again in a year or two.
Thanks a million, Lucas. I really enjoyed talking with you.
To see
Thanks,
other
Lorcan. Likewise.
health
Take
and
care.
longevity
Bye.
protocols,
Bye now.
watch this.